Thank you for participating in the NIA and NHLBI Entrepreneur Workshop Series. This workshop covers the topic of Value Propositions and Differentiation. This breakout room, moderated by Dawn Rose, discusses the topic of the unique value proposition.
Well, welcome everyone to the Value Proposition breakout room. As they used to say in the old days in airplanes, this is the value proposition room. If you're not on this, if it isn't the flight you wanted, then you may want to switch to a different breakout room, which you can do by leaving this room and going into another room. While we're waiting for people to come on board, I would recommend going ahead and opening up that survey just so you have it available, and then you can pop the answers in at the end. Don't fill it out yet, of course, because we haven't finished yet. And in terms of questions, there were a number of folks who have put questions in as part of the registration. So I have a document that I'm looking at that has those questions in it, and I'll try to get to those questions as well. And if you have questions that are that you need to have answered that we're not going to answer, I can either open up the floor to those questions. I'll be doing that periodically as we go through this session, or if you want to put it in the chat, then they'll actually just copy those over to my document that I'm monitoring in real time, because it's hard to read the chat. So that's just how logistically we're going to be working this breakout room. So first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about value, because we had value proposition as this kind of headline topic here, and there were a couple questions that came in about value and value proposition that I wanted to address. And I think there's kind of two levels of value that people think about. One is the value proposition of the product for the customer, and that's really the main focus of today. Is how do you develop that value proposition? How do you pitch it? What does it mean? Those kinds of things. But there's also kind of company value, and that's a little bit different. That's a little bit different value proposition in a sense. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but I will kind of talk about it briefly here. And from an investor perspective, when I say investor, I'm talking about venture capital investor, partner investor, angel investor, someone who has made an equity investment in your company. Value for them is really in multiple layers. First, they're looking at the value proposition that you're going to be delivering value to the customer. That's important. But they're also looking at how are you going to build value for the company over time. And that value really is about exit value. That's how much will this company be worth one day when it's acquired or when it goes public. Those are the kind of two big exit events that can happen to a company. So that value is a different sort of value, and the value proposition is a slightly different. It's a different kind of value proposition. In other words, the value proposition there is, if you invest $10 today, I'll turn that $10 into $50 tomorrow, and that's the kind of the value proposition that you're creating for investors. That's really a return on investment conversation, not as opposed to value proposition. So I just wanted to put that out there, make sure that everybody understands kind of level set how we're talking about value and value proposition. Investor value is kind of layered on top of the value proposition that you're delivering to the customer. Okay, so that's the first thing, and then. So I guess one of the questions was, what are unique elements of value that will entice investors? And as I mentioned, I think the elements are certainly creating value by sales, creating value through intellectual property, creating value through future sales, creating value through future value that could be acquired by somebody down the road. So that's the kind of value proposition or really value around kind of an investment versus a company. But really, I want to spend most of the time today talking about what your value proposition to the customer is. And I particularly want to spend a little bit of time talking about the healthcare space because it's probably the least clear space. If you're doing a direct to consumer or B2B healthcare software sale, let's say you're selling a remote monitoring product that's directly to consumers, that's a pretty simple value proposition. And what I outlined in my slides, I think captures that. There's a fairly straightforward value proposition of you're going to create value for the customer is going to pay you for that value. In the healthcare space, it's a little more complicated because you've got payers, you've got providers, and you've got patients. And for each one of them, they may see different levels of value for your product. So for example, a provider, maybe it's a hospital system, or maybe it's a private practice, they may see value in terms of the revenue that you're generating for them. The payer, the insurance company, may see value in the reduction in cost or fewer readmissions of patients and things that are driving up costs in healthcare. So you may have to think about actually creating a different value proposition for each one of those groups as you're thinking about your value proposition in general, because it's slightly different as you're approaching these different audiences. And that was one of the questions that came up was, who is the value proposition for? And can be for multiple stakeholders. So one could be, as I said, a payer, one could be a provider, one could be a patient even, especially if patients are advocating for their own health care and they're advocating for a particular product because they've heard about it or it's been widely known on the market. So that's how you define a value, define value in the healthcare space. And how you define it, I think, is really about what are those economic values you're bringing to the table, and then how do you prepare a value proposition for a payer? Again, I think the payer needs to understand kind of cost savings or quality of care that you're going to be providing with your particular product. I'm going to stop there for a second and see if anybody has any questions that they want to have addressed around this specific area of kind of value propositions in the healthcare space, because it's probably the most important thing. So if you want to raise your hand, then I can recognize you. Anybody? Oh, I have a raised hand. Robert Hager. There he is. Robert.
Yes, thanks. I didn't quite understand the value proposition for the provider, like the physician or a neurologist, or how could you expand that a bit?
So I think that, as you know, providers are under a lot of pressure to see more patients, have better outcomes, things of that nature. So I'll give you a good example. I work for Hatteras Venture Partners, which is a venture capital firm, and we're investing in various firms. We had a company come to us that had software that allowed patients with back pain, let's just say as an example, patients with back pain to fill out a questionnaire and then use AI, use artificial intelligence to figure out whether that patient was a good candidate for neurosurgery. And so, in a sense, the software triaged patients for the provider, so that the provider would have the most likely neurosurgically relevant patients served up to them first, as opposed to maybe someone needs to go see physical therapy, or maybe somebody needs to go see a private practitioner, things of that nature. So, the value for the neurosurgeon is I'm spending less time meeting with patients that really don't have a need for my services. Does that make sense?
Yeah, although if they're spending less time with the patient, then they're not getting income.
Well, not less time, they're spending same amount of time, but the time they're spending are with the patients that are most relevant for their practice. So,
Okay.
if they spend time, and just again, this is just one example, but they're spending time with patients that really need to go see a physical therapist about their back, then that's not well spent time for a neurosurgeon to go through that process of analysis and diagnosis to then send them off to PT as compared to someone who really needs to see a neurosurgeon. So that's just an example of some value that's provided to the payer in terms of better resource allocation in a sense, which ends up being probably more revenue for them in the long run.
Yeah, would you also say it's valuable to have a provider recommend some device, say, that then the patient uses and finds value in it, and they then think more highly of their provider?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that certainly anytime a provider makes a recommendation or prescribes something or makes a referral and there's a positive outcome, then it certainly sheds positively on that, sheds positive light on that provider. Yeah. I don't know if they think about that as a value per se.
Yeah.
As opposed to revenue or seeing more patients or providing just better outcomes. I mean, I think that, at the end of the day, providers want their patients to have better outcomes.
Yeah, we're thinking of going to conventions and conferences where neurologists, say, are present and explaining our technology to them with the hopes that they will recommend that to their patients. So then our pitch will be to, say, neurologists walking through a conference area, an exhibit area.
Yeah, so you'll have to convince them why it's worth their time to recommend your product. If it's just purely great outcomes, there's no other option out there for my patients, then that may be valuable enough.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Great. All right, let's move on then so a question came in, how is value proposition different for SBI and angel and VC investors? So for that one, again, I think that we think about value proposition in kind of the two flavors I mentioned earlier. So one is the value proposition to the customer, the end user, or whoever that customer is, whether it's end user or a hospital system or whomever it is. That's value for them. That's creating value for those customers. And then the value proposition for an investor, of course, is, as I mentioned, how are you increasing the overall value of the company compared to the value proposition for the particular customer. So using IP and successful clinical trial data to shape the value proposition, there I think that and I mentioned kind of that my little Mad Lib template where you have, unlike others, unlike the competition, you do something differently. So there, I think, unlike the competition, we have a patent protected process and we have clinical validation. Now, the IP is really more value proposition for an investor who's interested in keeping people out of your space, a barrier to entry, as they say. Whereas a clinical validation is really value creation for the patient or for the customer when they have that sort of value created there. Okay, how do you succinctly define the value proposition for a fitness program where fitness cannot be protected by IP? So that question really is about whether IP is helping your value proposition or not. In that case, I wouldn't have the IP as part of the value proposition. I would really think about the fitness program creating better outcomes. So if the fitness program be something that is creating better health, creating fewer, managing a chronic disease, requiring fewer medications. Those are kind of the values that a fitness program can be useful for. Okay. So a question here from Paul Moss about service design be considered as IP value proposition that can be protected and marketed to investors. Maybe Paul, you could just come online and tell us a little bit more about your question. I'm not sure I got that one.
Yeah, hello, and thank you. The question I have is, when I see awardees putting together their programs, their product, or even in a sense their web platform for delivering a new kind of service, and say this might be in telehealth. And I'm recognizing that the market that they're trying to capture has real difficulties in seeing their product or their service availability is something that they can get for themselves. So in other words, it looks like there are some issues with the way the customer becomes aware of the service. Great one put out there by a number of awardees that I see in digital sensory technologies. But I recognize how that could actually reduce cost within that particular market for a certain population. But that population isn't as technically capable to identify that service. Is there a role that can be protected through a service line that acts as an intermediary between the emergent new technology that's now being sold and the market that needs to be better addressed more specifically and more, should I say, at a more micro level, that there's something missing in that proposition. So to sell the idea of being an intermediary.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think what you're talking about is a different business model. So, there's some people that do, B2C, they're doing directly to consumer, and maybe there's an intermediary who are doing business to business, and then the second business goes directly to the consumer in the intermediary layer. I think what you're talking about is addressing the issue of product adoption, where you have people who are not savvy on technology, for example, or don't know they have a problem, quite frankly, sometimes. And so there is, for many new technologies, an educational component that goes along with the product sale or the value proposition. So just creating the value proposition by itself may not be enough, and usually isn't enough to help somebody understand the value that's being created. Kind of what's built around that perhaps is an educational understanding that you do have this problem, that hospital readmissions is a problem, and now people know that, but in the past people didn't know that, and so you had to educate them that hospital readmissions are a problem, and you have a problem, and so here's your data, or here's national data that show hospital readmissions, and so that's the educational component of it. Whether there's a business in, I think part of your question is implying, is there a business in helping to, in a sense, translate or somehow reduce the barrier to adoption for a new technology? Maybe, I don't know. That's creating kind of another level of value. In other words, a value would be, I take your product and I bring it down to where people can understand it better. I can implement it better. I can help them understand their problem better. I can show the product market fit better than you can. So yeah, there may be an option there for that as a business, if I understand that. It's kind of part of your question.
Yeah, I think that gets right to the crux of what I'm trying to figure out, is how to really kind of formulate that kind of a proposition,
right,
for newly emergent companies in the telehealth space that may not be able to more fine-tunedly address markets that could really take advantage of that to lower cost, especially at the home-based care.
Yeah, so I would say in the telehealth space in particular, we're seeing a lot of deals, as you can imagine, post-COVID, semi-post-COVID, let's just say. And there's a lot of noise in the system about how you differentiate yourself. I mean, I've probably seen 8 different remote monitoring companies with sensors and things of that nature that are out there. And the question is, how do you differentiate yourself? How are you different than anybody else? And maybe you don't need to be. Maybe you just go get in the market and be a player, and then you're gobbled up and rolled up among a bunch of other ones. I don't know how this is going to play out, but it is a bit of a wild, wild west right now when it comes to kind of the telehealth, digital health space for sure.
There may be something to do with as well the gray digital divide that needs to be addressed at this infrastructural level as well, when we talk about how we are able to get those technologies into the home and make them more user-friendly.
No doubt. I do a lot of work in Western North Carolina, and bandwidth access is a precious commodity, if you will, and if you don't have that, then you can't really deliver healthcare. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, yeah. How is our product better than the products that are currently being marketed? And so this is where I think that product differentiation, and I'm a little bit out of the scope on the value proposition, but we're going to go ahead and go into product differentiation a little bit. So I think that it's easy to put a table together that shows product differentiation. How is my product different than the competitive product, for example? But the real question is, are those differences something the customer cares about? And so that's where a lot of customer discovery and customer interviews is really important, so that you understand what is important for the customer, and then you can apply that differentiator to that. So if you're 2 times faster, for example, that may be great, but the customer may not care about being 2 times faster, because that just creates another bottleneck somewhere else, or that's not important because speed is not an issue for them. Whereas cost may be an issue. So understanding, again, back to, usually it falls into one of those 3 or 4 categories: cheaper, better, faster. If you can understand from a customer's perspective which of those is best or is more important to them, then you can do that. So then you can kind of create a differentiation. So a little exercise that I'll put out here, and I can't really share this on the screen, but a little exercise is to create a XY graph where the x-axis is one of the key drivers or key decision or key aspects of value for the customer. So let's just say it's time. And so, high speed versus low speed, that's your axis. Y-axis is another variable like cost. Low cost at the top, preferably, high cost at the bottom. And then you can map out on that 2-dimensional space how your product fits relative to the competition. So you can do high speed at low cost, you're in the upper right quadrant. And where does the rest of the competition map out relative to that? Assuming that those 2 drivers or variables are important to the customer. Again, you can't put things on there they don't care about. So differentiation is important, but differentiation has to be done in the context of what the customer finds as important. Any questions about that real quick while we got on that subject of differentiation? So I'll see in the chat real quick here, somebody direct message to me, is there a good set of worksheets or exercises to work through developing and honing the value proposition? So I assume, Monique, these slides are going to go out to people. And so they've got at least my little Mad Lib thing there. Is that correct?
Yes, this is Lainey. Don, the slides will go out, and so they'll have access to all the links and all the content as well.
Great. So the only thing I would add is there's a book called Running Lean by Ash Moira, and he has some value proposition stuff in there as well. But there are a lot of things out there on value proposition. So what else we have here on our list? So how do I effectively communicate my value proposition? I think that gets back to who you're communicating it to. And so certainly if it's, as I mentioned before, in the healthcare space, it depends on who's buying. Is the payer interested in this because of reimbursement issues? Is CMS interested in this because of reimbursement? Or is it a provider? Or is it a patient? So I think that how you communicate is probably less important than kind of who you're communicating to. And then who you're communicating to should drive how you maybe have to tweak that value proposition for the various stakeholders. So let's see, I'm looking at a couple of these. How How do I incorporate a value proposition into the pitch? Again, I think that's just part of the narrative, part of the story. I don't know if you want to have a specific, that value proposition statement that I used in my slides was really just the beginning of a way to articulate to somebody the value you're creating, and it helps you by thinking about a conciseness to it. That's important, because the last thing you want to do, I mean, I've been through a lot of pitches, and I hate to say it, I got to the end of the pitch and the question was, what exactly is the product and what does it do? That's pretty basic. But then beyond that is, what value does it provide? And those when investors, so really think about it from an investor or a customer perspective, they want to know what value it provides, and is that value greater than what's currently being provided on the marketplace today? And if so, how? How is it differentiated? That's really, in a succinct way, what that value proposition statement is. And again, you don't have to use that statement itself in your pitch, but those elements in that value proposition statement are the key elements of the pitch. You've got a problem, you've got a solution, you're delivering value, you're delivering in a different way than anybody else, and you're delivering it to a market that needs that value, that needs that solution provided. It's not that much more complicated with that. A few more minutes. I want to open this up to anybody who has any questions about value proposition, differentiation, things that kind of relevant to this idea of creating value or demonstrating value to investors or to customers. Just raise your hand, and then we'll have a chance to hear from you. I think that gets most of the questions that I want to get to today. So with that, I think Laney and Monique, we're probably ready to sign off, or if you want to jump to another room, they may still be doing some discussions there, and you can jump in on that perhaps. But we appreciate your time today. And Keith Boer has raised his hand. Last minute, Keith.
Hey, Don, thanks for taking the time. So I have a question about when you're creating these value propositions or targeting identifying your target, who you're trying to pitch to. And I want to give kind of an example. So for many of these disruptive technologies, you may be coming up an entrenched interest. So I can think of, some of the examples we've talked about today. Maybe you have a new molecular test that would completely replace a lot of the imaging that might be, give you a lot of information, but sort of an expensive means of diagnosing a cancer, for example. In those cases, can you think of an example where, maybe in, working with your venture firm, how to help scientists or clients who do have an innovative product, but maybe coming against certain entrenched interests, and how to identify the proper target person to pitch to?
Yeah, that's a great question. What you're talking about again is kind of the barrier to entry or product adoption barriers that are out there that are created, especially in the medical field, where you have people who've been doing things the same way for a long time. In fact, inertia is probably one of the biggest competitors out there, because people want to do things the way they've been doing them for a long time, and it really takes a lot to convince them to do a different way. And that's why I'm not going to quite answer your question, but that's why I think that showing a quantifiable value proposition to somebody is kind of the first step, so they can see it in terms of real economic value. So just telling somebody that you've got a better test is one thing, but if you have a better test in, 10-fold increase in sensitivity, or false negatives or false positives, or it's 10-fold cheaper than currently the way they're doing it, then that's those quantifiable sort of elements can be important as somebody thinks about your product. But in terms of entrenchment, a lot of times, if you can find the champion in the system first and identify that person, that helps you then get around to other people in the area. So finding those champions is not easy, but identifying them early on, especially if it's a new technology, maybe somebody who has an interest in that area of saving money or providing some better care or something, then you leverage that person's enthusiasm for kind of going to the next person. Keith, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Don. Thanks very much.
Okay. All right, with that, we are going to conclude this breakout session. And again, feel free to leave and go to another room if they're still going on, but glad you could be here, and we will talk to you later. Take care.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, everyone. One last plug for the feedback form. I just put it in the chat. We'd really love your feedback so that we can make these events.
Yes, please do that.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
All right.